Hello everyone, Happy New Year and welcome back to the Rogue Monkey podcast. We've got some hugely exciting things in the pipeline for 2021. Season 4 has almost finished being recorded, our innovation lab is being launched, and we've got a monthly mail out for everyone to get free content in addition to the podcast. Make sure you're signed up to our mailing list, the link to which is in the show notes, and you're also signed up to our social media accounts. We're on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. Just search for the Rogue Monkey podcast or head to our website theroguemonkey.org. Now, on to today's episode, and we've put together a special review show looking back across the last 12 months and getting some insights and thoughts from you, the listeners. 3 of our listeners join us in this episode to share their highlights, what the conversations have meant to them, and our final guest turns the tables and starts asking me some questions, which opens up some interesting discussions. We're going to hear from Nikhil, Lauren and Danny across the next hour, and I hope their thoughts and some of my feedback is of interest. So, let's get into it and our special 2020 review episode of seasons 1, 2 and 3 of the Rogue Monkey podcast. Hello Nikhil, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you, Kevin, for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
Well, thanks for sharing some time with us today. We've part of this special episode that's hopefully going to review 24 exciting shows that we've put out this year, and excited to get some thoughts from you. But just wondered if you could share with our viewers and listeners out there kind of who you are and where you are on your journey.
Yeah, so as Kevin said, my name's Nikhil. I'm a final year sports studies student at the University of Hertfordshire. The career goal is to go into teaching. I've been lucky enough to fall into Kevin's wonderful assistance at the right time. He's been really helpful, just with helping me on the process of developing as an individual, but also get into the world of teaching and kind of start my journey as a potential PE teacher in secondary schools is what I'm looking at, but just opening up my options.
Okay, that's awesome. I guess just to give everyone a little bit of context there, we've started something that will be formally going live in January called the Rogue Monkey Innovation Lab, where we're aiming to actually just voluntarily, with myself and my network, supporting the next generation of students and anyone else out there who's just looking for some guidance and connections within the network of sport and the wider sports world. So that was kind of how our discussion started, and actually it's spiraled into some interesting podcast discussions. So how did you actually come across the podcast in the first place?
So I was fortunate enough to hear from a university lecturer about the Rogue Monkey podcast, but funny coincidence, a lecturer from my first year, a great guy, David Turner, he came onto the podcast, and I'd heard that it was there. I'd never really thought, let me go and listen to it, because he'd left, and I kind of thought, I'm not doing coaching anymore. Why is it relevant? But it just came to me one day. I've already learned from him. I so enjoyed being around him. Let me go and experience it for myself. And I'm so grateful that I've gone and done that. What I've picked up, not from David Turner's podcast alone, but from all the ones that I've watched and all the bits of gems that I've picked up, the chance to go and learn from some of these people that you've interviewed and had discussions with about the importance of sport and what it's done for them and their background has really just acted as a kind of motivation for me to just carry on with my journey. And I'm sure we're going to discuss what my journey is and what I've taken from it. But yeah, so just to summarize, a former lecturer was the principal reason I started listening to the podcast, but I'm so happy I have.
Oh, it's brilliant. And, David was lecturing as well when I was at university, and somebody that's been very supportive, I guess, of my journey. And I feel like this is kind of that paying it forward opportunity where hopefully we can share some of our journeys with other people. So, okay, zoning in on David's talk, which was season 1, episode 3 of the podcast. What was your kind of main takeaway or things that have really stuck with you from that discussion?
So I already knew David worked in education. He told me several times, but listening to him speak, there was a few things that I picked up on. One was when he said the role was to facilitate performance and facilitate learning. You're helping others help themselves. Currently working in a school myself, I see that. I can apply that. It's not about me as a teacher. It's me helping someone, a student in a football lesson, develop as a student generally, not just in a football lesson. That can be their physical, their mental, or their social well-being. Also, the fact that, and he said this to me countless times, lifelong learning, be curious. I always used to think as a first year student, I am not interested once I finish university. That will be the end of reading and academia. And here's me now, 2 years later, wanting to stay in education. But that's simply because I've adapted to want to learn lifelong. I've wanted to become curious and to remain self-driven to constantly improve. And that was a big thing. And that comes from that intrinsic motivation that David spoke quite a bit about in length. Having that ability to say to yourself, this is the reason why you want to do it. And from other podcasts, sure we'll speak about, understanding the why has come up quite a few times in the podcast, and it really is relevant to where I'm at and where I plan to go.
Understanding your why is a huge one, and I guess this is our first name drop or recommendation for a book. If you've not read Start With Why, it's a huge book to get your head round, I guess, just your own purpose as well as potentially your careers and those sorts of things, but actually just you as a person. What do you stand for? What do you believe in? And I think that kind of helps a lot with clarity. Do you feel like as you moved through, like, I know you listened to more than one episode, did you feel like there were parts that kind of linked from, even if it was just by chance, where actually someone said something and you went, oh, they've mentioned something similar to those sorts of things? Did that come up at all?
Yeah, like I said, the understanding why, I feel like came up quite a bit. I feel like it was, I think it was the passion, what passion you have. I think it was Helen Davis's podcast where she spoke about understanding the passion you have, but then at the same time, I want to say it was the Jennifer Say interview where she talked about putting the human first, but you also need to understand why. The whole concept of putting yourself first means prioritizing and understanding your passion and your purpose, and then working from that forwards. So for me, that would be, why do I want to go into teaching, and then apply that as a teacher, rather than this is my job and this is why I do it. It should be, this was why I joined the profession. This is why we are athletes, or why we love a sport. And then you work to your greatest performance. Another huge thing that I've picked on throughout, and I'm going to keep the term, and I'm gonna make it my own, is relentlessly consistent. That term has cropped up in all the podcasts I've listened to, whether they've used that term specifically or they've spoken about it. I love the idea of just constantly working to improve. I feel like it was Jake Humphrey that said you can't be consistent on a Monday and then slack off on the week and then start again on a Friday. That's not how it works. You need to go in every day and perform at your best. And of course, there's going to be circumstances that come in the way and you have to overcome. But telling yourself that you have the ability to be as good as you can be every day is something that I want to develop and continue to try and achieve.
I really liked that. There was some real differences, I guess, between the different people you've spoke about there. So Helen, I know from my world of sports psychology, and we actually ended up recording twice, 1 or 2 weeks before lockdown, and then we actually added a bit to the recording once lockdown was announced, because so many events were cancelled and so many athletes and coaches in the sports world were kind of at a bit of a loss with everything. So it was quite a timely episode to actually put out. And then you mentioned about Jennifer Say. That was a fascinating discussion, and I think if you've not watched that documentary, to the listeners out there, go back and watch Athlete A. It's on Netflix. It's a huge, I wouldn't say life-changing in the sense of it hasn't necessarily changed my course. It's just an experience that blew my mind away of how lost organizations can become. And I think the horrifying aspect of it being involving children, obviously, that's something that so many people who work in sport have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, working with young people, that to see how negative it can become was just eye-opening and completely shocking. So that was, for me, like looking back, that was just, it was staggering. But then you mentioned, like Jake Humphrey, and he runs a podcast himself, which we had him and his co-host on across season 2 and season 3, and their insights talking about relentlessness, which you've already mentioned, and being consistent and being honest and not necessarily expecting everything to go smoothly. And you've already alluded to that. And I think for so many young students, coaches, whatever career path you're pursuing out there, it's not a straight line from A to Z. So I think it's a very astute observation, but something that if you're going to make your mantra, is really going to benefit you on your journey, I guess. And I know you sent me in advance, you've listened to quite a lot of the episodes. So if you had to pull it all together and actually say there was one thing for me that has really shaped my journey so far, and hopefully going forwards for years to come, what would it be, or who was it that said something that really stuck with you?
I think a general kind of thing I'm definitely taking away from this is to overcome adversity, you need to become resilient, and that will only happen over time. But the more you tell yourself you can do it, and that positive outlook and growth mindset will allow you to then overcome anything that stands in your way, whether that's me as a student now or moving forward into my profession. I don't think there's a particular term apart from relentless consistency that I will make my own, because I feel like all the podcasts I've listened to, there's been gems of information that I've noted and I will make my own. But definitely, I do think that relentless consistency is something that I plan to use moving forward. I mean, across all the podcasts, I mean, the Rosie Meek one in particular, completely out of the ordinary, different to all the other podcasts that I've listened to and that are on the channel. But to apply a similar kind of concept of sport and physical activity, something that's so outside of the norm of what you've kind of explored, I found fascinating. But there again, it was talking about having a routine and program, and that all relates to being consistent and being relentless and just growing as an individual. So yeah, for sure, that's my takeaway for sure.
Well, that's fantastic. And as part of the Innovation Lab going forwards, we are going to do kind of a monthly mail out with some, I guess, follow-up articles from both our interviewees on the podcast, but also some of the people who have actually benefited from it out in the wider world. So I can already feel you putting pen to paper for a guest article maybe in 6 months' time to let us know how your journey's going. But for now, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you so much for having me on, Kevin. It's been a pleasure.
Hi, Lauren. Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Thanks for joining us today. It's always nice to hear from the listeners. We've already heard from, I believe, Nikhil, but we want to get some insights from yourself. But firstly, give us a quick introduction, who you are, where you're from.
Okay, so as Kevin mentioned, I am Lauren Baker. I'm studying for a PhD at the University of Hertfordshire. I look into performance physiology for elite swimmers. I did most of my research up at Loughborough, but now I've come back, obviously studying at University of Herts, come back down to the labs, and I'm analysing saliva samples, blood samples from the athletes I took up at Loughborough. Currently writing up for that final phase of research. So yeah, that's what I do. Little broad intro.
Okay, that sounds pretty interesting. It's certainly an area we don't delve too much into on the podcast. So I'm a little bit curious. Why did you want to listen to the Rogue Monkey? What kind of things did interest you when you first came across the show?
So I find that my PhD research, well, any PhD research is very blinkered, so very narrow area what you look into. And the area I look into is very quantitative. So it's all numbers, very small. I look at saliva samples. I look at the physiological performance side of things, whereas the podcast offers more of a psychological view. So the other aspects of performance that I necessarily wouldn't view normal day to day.
Okay, cool. That's interesting. You picked that up. Let's bring that out a little bit and talk about specific episodes. So were there any across the 24 we've had this year that you listened to and kind of really took something from or surprised you or whatever it was?
So one that stood out was, I quite enjoyed Lucy and Reese's podcast. Obviously, still from a swimming background, I quite enjoyed to listen to that one. But I didn't realise how many struggles that Lucy faced in regard to going from like an age group athlete to performance. Listening about her talk about not being able to get sponsors and things like that. It's just challenges that she faced that you wouldn't necessarily know from unless you heard her speak about it, like from her Instagram, it looks amazing. And her path just seemed so like natural and progressive, like she's moved up the ranks and everything. But there are those factors and problems that she faced throughout that you wouldn't necessarily know. So I found that interesting.
We've certainly pulled back the curtain on a few things. And I think I took a lot away from that discussion with Lucy. Having known her for quite a while now, I think it's very interesting to hear people's own perceptions on their journey. And actually giving you insights that even when you know them, you don't necessarily are aware of. So actually it was, I really enjoyed it. And I've listened back to it a couple of times now and you're like, wow. And she's still got so much ahead of her as well, which is obviously really exciting.
Exactly. And new challenges and new goals. I'm sure she's having problems facing, but just unknown to us. And she'll keep pushing forwards even despite everything else. So.
Okay, so we talked about the Lucy and Reese episodes there, which were episode 14 and 15. Were there any others that particularly jumped out at you?
Yeah, I loved the pilot, Andy.
Yeah.
Just hearing him talk about flying was amazing for someone that has no clue or background knowledge on that at all. So I found that really interesting. And obviously you asked him, what's it like to fly at the speed of sound? Like, you can't ask many people that, and I found that that episode particularly quite interesting to hear, just because I knew nothing about it. But yeah, that was really good learning about how many decisions he had to make in such short amount of time and things like that. I found really interesting on that episode. And I suppose as well, what stuck out, because we watched Athlete A. Well, I watched the program and listening to, was she the producer of Athlete A?
Yeah.
Just hearing her brutal honesty, and when she said about the girls coming to her and thanking her for producing this show and allowing them to speak out loud about what had happened, and be so, just the brutal honesty and the truthfulness behind it all was really a bit harrowing, but also lovely to hear, I suppose, in a really weird way. You want to know that they felt safe coming to her, and then producing that show made more people come out and speak about what had happened to them. So I thought that was a really nice episode as well in regard to that.
It's been an interesting thread that's kind of come out across this year, has been the level of honesty from people. And I think specifically with what you talked about there with the Jennifer Say episode, which was episode 17, it was harrowing, because everyone, understands the difficulties, I guess, of hearing those kind of stories about kids. That is horrible. And I've read her book as well, and actually you get an even more detailed insight into it actually from kind of a first person view when she's talking about what it was like as an 8, 10, 12-year-old. And I think I kind of mentioned it again there with Lucy and Reese. Actually, it was really interesting to get the individual's perspective instead of like the external. I mean, you mentioned earlier about seeing things on Instagram and stuff like that, and it's quite interesting to actually pull back the curtain, get underneath their skin a little bit, and actually, because they're so forthcoming and honest, it really does bring it to life. So no, it's that's really interesting you pick up on that. So cool. I'm curious now about, I guess, the next step of all of this, like the impact on it, because you've listened to all these different things. You work in, like you said, a very focused and potentially blinkered environment, but actually there are probably some things here that have really helped build up your kind of awareness. So what were kind of the things that have stuck out that you've listened to and then actually taken back into your kind of workplace or your personal interests?
I think the main thing would be really the blinkered environment, I suppose. Having that, listening to the podcast gives you so many different and like an insight to understanding performance pathways beyond the surface of it all. So like the ideal, the Instagram, the perfection that's shown, the struggles that are faced, the other pathways that I would necessarily think about, the psychology behind it, all the environmental factors are things that I don't get to look into and don't get to really research. Like I said, my data is very quantitative. So the qualitative side of part performance for me, that's what I find interesting to listen to on your podcasts. That's
really, really cool. I think one of the things even when you work in sport, until you kind of delve down into some of these things, it's the understanding and the awareness of the range of things that actually impact on whether it's an athlete or somebody who's going to become a pilot or whatever it is. Like, there's so many areas to consider. And actually in sport, we can get a bit blinkered of thinking it's all about sport. But actually, even in sport, there's impact from their education and their home life and their friendship circles and whatever it is they're up to. So again, it's been cool to explore that. So awesome.
Physiologically, I suppose, you could be the best physiologically. Well, you get to the Olympics, don't you? In the last one, talking swimming related, but in the race, they're all physiologically, most of them, the best you could possibly be. They're doing the maximum amount physiologically you can do. There's obviously, for me, ideas of like best performance person having like the better performance thing at the top, having, I don't know, more hemoglobin, like physiologically being advantaged. But at the end of the day, when you get to that level, they're all going to be very similar. And I think the podcast makes you realise not just sport, but having a mental advantage is going to be the one that makes the winner over the one that gets second. So that sort of thing as well that I wouldn't necessarily get to think about is what's really been brought to light with when listening to the podcast.
Cool. Well, thanks for sharing your time with us, Lauren. It's nice just to hear from different aspects, because we've got, Nikhil, an aspiring undergrad student. We're going to hear shortly from Danny, who's actually a lecturer, and then obviously the insights from yourself. So no, it's been really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing some time with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Hello. Thanks for joining us, Danny. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Hi, Kevin.
Oh, it's nice to have another academic on the show, because we've had actually a few guests this season, a couple of which I believe you know. So excited to kind of explore your views on the year. But if you can just give our listeners just a bit of an introduction to who you are.
Absolutely. So hi, everyone. My name's Danny Buckley, and I'm currently a lecturer at the University of Hertfordshire. Alongside doing that, I also am in my third year of my PhD. So I'm hopefully edging toward the end of that. But yeah, I lecture on sport, health and exercise at the University of Hertfordshire.
So I'm sure you picked up quite a few things from across this year, because we've talked, not necessarily every single episode, but certainly health, exercise and sport was featured prominently in quite a few of our episodes. So when looking back really across the last 12 months, what's kind of stuck with you? What resonated with you the most?
Yeah, I guess I suppose from my perspective, I may look at your podcast in a slightly different light. Not only was I maybe one of the first people that listened to it because you was nagging me all the time to watch your first recording. Maybe I was your first ever listener, I'm not sure. But I guess instead of trying to learn about performance sport or be involved in performance sport or high performance people or people achieving the highest they possibly can in their field, whatever they're doing, for me, it's really interesting as an educator to pick up the learning involved in their journeys. So, as you said, you've had academics before. I believe you've recently interviewed one of my students, which again is quite exciting. And you've also interviewed some really incredible people that do incredible things. For example, Red Arrows pilots and stuff. But what they all have in common for me, and what all the podcast episodes have in common, in my opinion, is everyone has a different process to how they learn things and how they pick up information. And for me, that's absolutely vital. For example, I had a lecture earlier today where I taught over 200 students, all of which probably learn in completely different ways. So for me, understanding how people shape their journeys to become who they are, but also, I guess, watching and speaking and listening to people and speaking about how they become who they are and what that journey looked like and how they educated themselves, for me is what's mostly interesting about the podcast. And that's what I take most away from what you do and what you speak to people about.
That's really, really fascinating. Because obviously you talked there about already referencing your day job, has any of the things kind of resonated with you to a point where you actually stand up in front of a group of students, for example, and are perhaps a bit more mindful of how you talk to the group and how you present information to them?
Absolutely, all in their own ways. So, for example, I've got some notes in front of me, which I will refer to, obviously, because there's been so many episodes. But it goes all across the board, really. For example, Sarah Barrow, when she was talking about resilience, that 100% relates to not only my journey in doing a PhD. You have to be resilient to continue that process, but also I believe every single one of my students this past year have been resilient. It's been a completely new experience for all of us. And for someone to sit down, call themselves a university student, but actually work completely from their bedroom, you have to have an element of resilience to do that. But I don't want to make his head bigger than it probably already is, in case he does listen to this. But the one that completely relates to me, and the one I guess I took the most from was David Turner's interview. I think simply because I know David, and I do truly believe that I am an educator because of the way that David taught me. So to give some context, I was one of David's students as a university student. His outlook on education is slightly different to mine, but there are some crossroads. And David has always been a strong believer in ownership and being independent and doing things because you want to do them. So he's never believed in which I believe the university system is moving to is a bit of hand holding and doing things to support students as much as possible. Now, don't take that the wrong way. I'm not trying to make things harder for students, but David's always believed in if you want to do something, then you will do it. And if that's the process that you follow, then you will get more out of that system, or you'll get more out of what you're trying to do. There's a huge concept that we use in education called hertagogy, which is it's believed to be a scaffolding approach where you enable the students, or you give the students the tools to do something themselves or take something further. And that's something that David's always believed in. And I guess, to answer your question in a long-winded way, that is something that I have adopted from his interview, I guess, is to allow my students to take a bit more ownership and be a little bit more self-driven rather than do everything for them and provide them with all of the answers. Which I know is completely against David's philosophy.
I like that. And I think that's something that, again, I guess reflecting myself, if you look back across the season and also following up on some of the individual guests' own careers and things they're involved in, you can see a massive level of resilience, and you can also see this kind of independence and ownership over their own destiny. And I think whether that was kind of aspirational, like when we had David Montenegro in the last episode where he talked about, as a young boy, I want to do this for the rest of my life. It captivated his interest and he would do whatever he had to get there. And then you had others that actually talked about huge challenges they had to overcome along the way. Kirsty Murphy rings a bell on that. Jake Humphrey kind of opened our interview with saying, I failed my A-levels, and that was the biggest starting point for me. And actually, although they all go on this individual journey, whether it's students, whether it's guests on a podcast, or anyone else you come across in life, the ones that often form these kind of successful paths for them, it's them that's driving it. And I think a lot of that stems on the work, whether it's at primary school, secondary school, college, university. If they go to university, actually they have people in their life that instill that kind of mentality in them. So that's kind of where you are now. You're the torchbearer, kind of passing it on to all these students that they take ownership over their learning.
Oh, yeah. I think now more than ever, they have to. They can't, for example, today come and knock on my door and come and say, "Oh, Danny, I've written this. What do you think about it?" Or, "I'm struggling with this lecture slide. What does it mean?" They can't do that. Obviously, there's things in place to support people with an online virtual educational environment, but that ownership has to take over. And I guess it's the common theme from all of your guests, to be honest with you. Again, please disagree with me if you don't agree, but I don't remember any of your guests on any episode saying, "Oh yeah, this person did that for me," or "I couldn't really be bothered to do it, so I just sat back and let it happen." Every single athlete has been through that. I've been up at 4 a.m. every morning. I've pushed myself. I got myself to training. I've done this, or it was down to me to make this happen. And self-ownership is the recurring theme in all of your episodes on every single podcast. People don't become excellent by sitting back and letting the journey happen without them. I read a really, really good book, and it really annoys me right now that I can't think of the name of it, so I'll have to send it to you. But on the very last page, I actually tweeted the author, which is even more annoying because I can't remember it. But he said something like, your life's happening now. So don't be the backseat driver. Be the person at the steering wheel. Make things happen. Direct the car to the way that you want it to turn, rather than let someone else make that decision for you. And I do believe that all of your episodes have shown that is determination, motivation, being self-driven. Has led these people to achieve amazing things. And I do believe our students do require some extra support at the moment. And I do believe a lot of people require extra support at the moment. But by sitting back and letting things happen completely out of your control, it, in my opinion, isn't the way to live your life and excel in the career that you want to.
I really like that. And I think this is a really powerful message around taking ownership over not just your journey from an academic career point of view, whatever it is, actually life. And I think this year alone, there's been a lot of people who have probably sat back, whether they've been furloughed or whatever it is, or they've had opportunities to do things, and actually they've taken the easy option. And I think something that comes out of the show's guests, but also many other kind of success stories that I've followed in various walks of life, they make difficult choices and they don't necessarily choose the easy path of least resistance. You know, they embrace challenge, they embrace difficulty. And with some people, the glass, you know, half empty kind of mindset, they very much don't sit in that camp. It's very much, I've got this time, however awful the situation is, how can I move forwards out of it? How can I do something that's going to benefit me in the long run? And actually have that kind of growth mindset that everything is an opportunity.
Yeah, I think a very good example of that, not to say that me and you are currently excellent in our fields or doing above and beyond or whatever, but, you know, we both have full-time jobs and we both have other commitments in our lives, and we're both still doing education. So I believe if there is a goal in sight or there's something that you're destined to do, then by simply saying you're too busy or you don't have the time to do it, I just don't think it's good enough. I have many colleagues that do the same job as me that don't do a PhD and don't take up that opportunity. And I'm sure you have many colleagues that you work with that haven't taken up the opportunity to go back to university education. But as I said, it's a self-driven thing. You've got to do that in your own time. But if there's an end goal and if it's something that you want to achieve, then you need to push yourself to do that.
I think there's a level of humility in it as well. And I kind of picked that up in my own journey, perhaps before I even started the podcast. But I think, I don't see it as a negative, actually recognizing the gaps in your knowledge, experience and expertise and actually actively trying to fill them. And David talked about it a lot when I was actually studying under him, and also when we did the podcast, about this ongoing journey of learning. And it doesn't have to be through university, you know, it doesn't have to even be formal education in any respect. It doesn't have to be a course, you know, just pick up a book, go and watch a YouTube video, go and have a conversation with somebody, pick up the phone. But actually, it's this self-improvement. You know, I'm thinking like Kaizen, you know, every single day, how when I go to bed and I'm casting my mind back, I think to episode 20 something with Alan Stein, where he turned around and said, every night when you put your head on the pillow, you've exchanged 24 hours of your life for something. And are you happy with that exchange? And I'm like, that is the attitude. When you look at all these people, and it's not saying you've got to be on it all the time, because you've got to work and you've got to recover. But actually, there's this mindset of trying to move forwards and striving for something. And it's not saying to people, you must be successful at this or you must be successful at that. It's just saying, what do you want to achieve in this week, this month, this year in your life? And actually, are you prepared to do what is necessary to get there? And it's kind of a balancing act that runs in conflict, I guess, to society nowadays, which is very much instant gratification, everything yesterday, you know, 0% credit, all of those sorts of things, where actually the world is becoming more and more set up for everything immediately. Whereas the fact of a personal journey doesn't change. It's a journey that you go on over quite a long period of time.
And it is completely personal, you know, how you, for example, how you define success would be entirely differently. It would be entirely different to how I would define success. So people see it as an intrinsic thing. People see it as an extrinsic thing. Is it having a degree in your hands? That might be the most important goal, or that might, in your opinion, or in your household or your parents' minds, define success in that situation. Or someone that's doing an apprenticeship, for example, they don't want to get a degree, so they wouldn't see that as a successful outcome on life. So I think it depends on what the goal is and what the drive is to become successful. But I think only you and yourself can define whether you've become successful in life or not. And I think that's actually where the crossroad is in these podcasts. Is I deem pretty much actually all of your previous guests as successful in their own right. But whether someone else would look at your guests and say they're a successful person, it's completely down to them, I guess. It can't be defined by one simple definition, in my opinion.
Well, without jumping ahead, one of the, I guess, curious requests, because I've had quite a few people get in touch and say obviously they're keen to come on and share the ideas. So I think we've got about 6 people that are going to be featuring on this episode. But you actually came back and said, can I ask you some questions, which I shouldn't really be surprised of, because you've got a research hat on and you constantly asking questions all the time in your life. So I basically handed the microphone over to you.
Yeah, sure. I don't know. I listen to your podcast sometimes, and I think that's quite a hard question to answer. So I thought it'd actually be quite amusing, or yeah, just a really good way to turn the table and almost get some payback on you. And I thought I might be the better person to do that because we have a friendship outside of this podcast. So yeah, why not? I've got 5 questions actually, if you fancy answering them.
Okay, let's go.
So I've written them down, so I'm going to ask you word for word. So Kevin, what I really want to know is why? Why did you start this podcast? Can you select one defining moment from your past that you thought to yourself, I need to do this. This is something I need to do. I need to create the Rogue Monkey podcast.
Okay. Well, I can almost answer the first half of the question with a book. So I've got a friend called Chris based down West Country, swimming coach, massively into his books, similar to myself. And every time we see each other at an event, he says, oh, you've got to read this book. Oh, you've got to read that book. And it was either last year at the National Championships or the year before, he said, you need to read Simon Sinek's Start With Why. And I was like, okay. So, it goes on my list, one of the many Amazon deliveries that keeps popping through the door. And I read it and it really started, I guess, to not necessarily make me question my philosophy, but to more understand my philosophy, because where I am is where I am. And I'm very mindful of people. I like getting to know people. I like having conversations with people, and I love hearing their stories. So I guess part of who I am is actually I enjoy that relationship, that conversation with just anybody about their journey. And that, a lot of people said, 2020, it's a lockdown project. And I was kind of like, absolutely not. Actually, this was launched in January, just conveniently 2 months before lockdown started. And it was kind of off the back of the first episode with Ferez, because we'd met years beforehand at an event, stayed in touch, followed each other's journeys, if you like, I was kind of relatively new into my role, going into the talent ID and coach development world, and he was going into the digital space when it came to sports apps. And I was like, that's a really cool story. And then I thought, what other stories are there that I'd really be interested to share? Very often when you go to a conference or anything like that, you're sharing discussions, usually over a beverage or two. And actually, it's just sharing stories that's powerful in itself. You don't, obviously conferences are hugely valuable, but actually just spending time with people who maybe have similar interests or the complete opposite interests, and actually sharing stories is a really powerful tool. So I then thought, I wonder if I can package these up, and was talking to a guy back in October, November time in 2019 about it, who works in commentary. And we were bouncing around a few ideas, and he said, podcast isn't that hard to do. Little did I know. But obviously I thought, well, okay, let's explore this a little bit. So messaged a few people, Ferez, David included, another guy called Wayne I knew out in Australia, and said, look, guys, be interested in recording a few discussions with you. What can we do about it? And then it started to snowball, and it snowballed quite quickly because I'll openly admit, for the first 8 episodes, I made it up as I went along. Didn't really have a clue what I was doing. The kit wasn't great. The lighting wasn't great, even though most of it was filmed without video. It was just silly little things, but this is a learning journey. But actually, I kind of came away from it, and the people I was talking to, like yourself and a few others, that were like, we've listened to it and be interesting to explore this and that and the other. And I guess the beauty of having something like lockdown is you had a lot of people sitting at home, not necessarily doing nothing, because obviously most of us were working from home, but actually you had a lot of people who had more flexible time, were getting used to using stuff like Zoom and other platforms. And it was kind of like, I think I got through something like 10 episodes in the space of like 16 weeks in terms of recording. But it was just, oh, you need to speak to that person. Oh, you need to have a conversation with that person. And very often I'd ask at the end of the episode when we would finish recording, who would you think would be an interesting person to speak to based on what we just spoke about? And they'd say, oh, you need to speak to this person or that person. And it just went from there. And it then got to a point where actually it was kind of like, well, what do I actually stand for as a person? And where does that kind of fit with the podcast? And a lot of it came down to the fact is we're all on a journey. And you talked about the students. Every single person I come across, whether they're in the professional world or kind of outside of work, I've found they're all going on a journey, and actually everyone has something to share. And it's just finding people that are obviously have time that they're willing to share and come on and explore it, but in a kind of not really with an agenda. because actually, like you said, everyone's different. Everyone's got their own route. So actually just give them the freedom to express that. And definitely some of the questions, I kind of think that's close to the mark. But then actually the stuff that comes out of it, it's almost like it's opening a suitcase of ideas for another area. So in the longest way possible, it started, I guess, with me analysing my own philosophy of sharing stories. And then actually, can we have a platform where that's shared with more people? And that's where we started, and it's evolved from there. Bet you wish you hadn't asked now.
No, I'm glad I asked. Did you watch Simon's TEDx talk quite a few years ago on the Golden Circle? Yeah. So it's almost like a glorified networking event, isn't it? That you're doing all the networking and everyone just gets to listen to you do the networking. Yeah,
it is in a kind of roundabout way. But I think one of the things, and again, no disrespect to any other podcasters out there, but a lot of podcasts have to become monetized because obviously it's for most people their jobs, or for a lot of people their jobs, and there becomes like, I guess, more of a corporate aspect to it. Whereas, I said to you before we started recording, I was on a phone to a guest last night, and we're just having a chat. And actually, that's what I want. Like, I want you to feel like when you're listening to the show that actually you could be at a conference, you could be in a bar, you could be on the phone to somebody the other side of the world, just having a catch up with a friend and going off and discussing a subject or a range of subjects. Because I think there's that level of authenticity in terms of my questioning, because it is naturally just a discussion. But also the people you're talking to, when they don't feel like it's a corporate interview, they tend to be a little less, not guarded, maybe is not the right word, but actually they're much more forthcoming in just sharing themselves instead of sharing maybe an aspect of themselves that they think you want to hear. And I think it's certainly not a skill I've cracked, but there's a real art, and I can see it in some podcasters that I really, really admire, like Damien Hughes, the one he does on the High Performance podcast. Like, I've watched that and I listen to some of the questions and I can see the layers almost like an onion unpeeling. And they actually astutely pick up on it in their show, that usually after about 20 minutes of them gradually just, picking away at it, suddenly that you start to see more of the person. And I love doing that. It's a really enjoyable aspect to it.
Good. I think that ties quite nicely into question number 2, which is what has been the most memorable moment for you during the podcast? And so what's that one thing that's really sticks out in your memory?
And there's tons, and a lot of it usually is the prep work that goes into it, because obviously you have to approach various guests. You sometimes have calls with them in advance to go through stuff. And I think about this quite a lot, especially like as this is a review episode and what's the year meant to me. And if I had to boil it down to one thing, very well recently during lockdown, as we all did, we tidied up our house. I tried to tidy up my house, but just moved mess from one room to another. And one of the things that I found was a load of old VHSs from like childhood family videos. And I chopped them all in and got them put on DVD, just so I've got them for long term. And there was one, it's probably one of my earliest childhood memories. I was about 5 or 6, and my grandfather used to rebuild Spitfires. That was what I was brought up around, like aircraft hangars, going to air shows, all those sorts of things, which you can probably tell that stokes my curiosity in talking to various pilots. But I remember as a little kid going along, and the footage brought it all back. And I, perhaps before the days of health and safety, went to a small airfield, stood on the edge of a runway and watched a Spitfire that my granddad had helped rebuild be pushed out in front of me, got to walk under it and you touch the wings and all those sorts of things, then watch it take off and have a 5 or 6 year old's hello and handshake with the pilot. And it was such a powerful memory that actually when I spoke, especially to the pilots around their childhood role models, if you like, and actually a lot of maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, those kind of experiences happened by chance. You had to be there. Whereas that's changed now. Like, you don't have to be there. I have a phone call with the guy in charge of the Red Arrows, and then an hour later, 4,000 people can listen to it. And actually, there's a lot to be said for, I guess, the accessibility that this platform offers. And I think in terms of a memorable moment, it's actually when I have a conversation with anyone, yourself, or people just away from the show, but actually they say, oh my God, I never knew that about that person, or that's fantastic, or that's really interesting, or that I've gone and read that book because of it. And actually it then becomes a really powerful thing. And not from an egotistical point of view, but actually it's nice to hear that you've had a positive impact on somebody else's life and they're in a better place because of it. And whether that's just the tiniest thing, like they've read a book, or, you know, for some people, the feedback we had from Kirsty Murphy's discussion, and somebody tweeted us in some really, really nice message about how it had really helped them go through difficult circumstances and stuff like that. And you think, wow, you know, I'm just sitting at home running this from, you know, the spare bedroom, but actually there's actually people out there that this is having a hugely positive impact on. And then, well, what's the biggest driver? It's the fact that we can do a lot more of this. There is, within reason, no limitations apart from a few startup costs. I'm up and I'm away now, and the only thing that's stopping me, I hope, is people coming back and saying, yeah, we'll come on the show. There's nothing really else that can stand in the way. And then you start writing a list of potential guests and you're like, how big could we go with this? But it's good fun, and I guess that's the most memorable part of it, is looking back and seeing how much I've enjoyed the journey, and it's kind of brought some of the best parts of my life out and then other people's to share.
Good. I really like your connection to Kirsty Murphy. Actually, I've got a quote written down here from her interview, which is, life is not all one big high. There are sometimes some low points. One low could knock you over, and sometimes you have no way of dealing with those things. It all comes with your life experience, which I completely agree with. Some things do happen in life, and sometimes you have to just get over them, don't you? So, I completely agree with your comments and with some of the feedback that you got on that interview, because I personally couldn't believe how honest and open she was, but also how, and I've written here as well, how down to earth she was. She was just so, you know, it was just, doesn't matter. Yeah, it's normal. Yeah, I hate using that word normal. But yeah, I guess you're right. So good. Right. The first of the challenging questions, because listening through your podcasts, as you've said already in question 1, I think it was, that you do ask some questions that I just think, that's a hard one to answer. So I thought I'd ask you those same questions. The first one was, and I guess it links to Kirsty's interview, I guess, but what's been the low point for you? Have you ever approached a moment where you just thought, oh, sod this, I'm going to give up? What's pushed you to continue?
I guess I'll answer it in 2 parts. First part is with professional hat on, as in this year professionally has been challenging for everybody. So I think a low point on this journey of the podcast has been dealing with this year. You know, when you are working on a screen 8-9 hours a day, I'm also, as you mentioned earlier, doing some studying. So on the spare time I've got, I'm also staring at a screen. And then you've got to spend time in evenings or weekends, then staring at a screen again to do some recording. And it's not in any way like kind of sounding like ridiculous, like, oh, you know, first world problems. But for me, actually, sometimes it was a real challenge when you're doing 14-15 hour days staring at a screen to stare at the screen some more. And that's, I wouldn't necessarily say it's been a low point. I would just say that's been a challenge. I think that, so on a professional front, it's been the journey of this year intertwined with the podcast journey. From a personal point, I guess it's been refinding myself. And this is something I've not really, haven't discussed it on the show, certainly not on air. So 2019 was the most horrific year of my life. Had some very horrible experiences that I had to deal with personally. And coming off the back of this year, I'd probably say I hit a lowest point back in the spring. And actually this last 6 months has been a journey to, I guess, re-find myself. And I don't want that to sound all kind of hippie and soul-y and that sort of stuff, but actually professionally and personally, who are you? What do you stand for? You know, what are you good at? What are you not good at? Where do you need to work? A level, I guess, of frank honesty with yourself. And I think, again, the lowest point, perhaps not, might be different for certain people, but I don't recognize my lowest points at the lowest point, if that makes sense. I recognize them retrospectively. So when you recognize how far you've come professionally and personally in a year, you can actually look back and say, wow, in the spring, I was in a really bad place. But, you know, there's a lovely quote, and I'm going to try and get it right, that talks about the sport of swimming, but I think you can apply the philosophy of that to how I view, or certainly my life over the last 18 months. Is swimming, from the outside looking in, you can't understand it, and from the inside out, you can't explain it. And I think that's a really nice way of looking at it, almost like a fishbowl effect. You know, you're looking at the fish, what's going through that fish's head, and the fish is looking outside going, what? You can never understand what's going through my mind. And I think that's where as you become more comfortable, and you've probably heard it through the episodes, I've become more confident in, I guess, where my limits lie, and actually going beyond those in a few cases, asking some quite difficult questions, because I've become more comfortable accepting my own limitations personally. And I think that's probably been the journey I've been on. But I say the low point was actually more recognizable once I'm out of the other half of it. So yeah, that's kind of all I've got with that, I guess. Unless you want to flesh that out.
No, I think we'll leave that there. I obviously I know what kind of year you'd had previously to starting the podcast, so
I think I guess, and I'm sure there'll be a few questions coming, but I guess just to give it some context, like had a shock death in the family, loss of my father through cancer, which was horrific. I had a very fortunate job at the time, still do, but actually that time, even though we weren't in lockdown, my company effectively said, go home, take your laptop with you, do what work you can when you need to. And I got to spend the last 5, 6, 7 weeks with my dad, and that was invaluable. And I think that lesson retrospectively is you cannot underestimate the time you have with those closest to you, whether that's family, friends, partners, whatever it is. And I guess the second kind of aspect of that was I didn't deal with it at all at the time. It happened in June 2019. I started my master's in September 2019, started the podcast in January, and then we hit lockdown. So all of those things combined, there was just constantly shelving up, I guess. And I think, again, you go on a journey personally that actually has enabled me to professionally excel, whether that's in my day job or with the podcast, because you've been more comfortable with dealing with your own issues.
Yeah. I remember speaking at the time, and we kind of joked about how something tragic has to happen for you to understand the meaning of time and the importance of time. So yeah, I'm completely with you on that, Kevin. Right, let's move on to question 4. Not such a hard question, but what's been your biggest shock, and why?
Generosity. And I wouldn't in any way say I was skeptical of people's as a species, saying, everyone's selfish. Quite the opposite. Everyone has their own lives. Everyone's very busy. But the volume of time, and I guess putting out there, just to give some context to the podcast, probably I record for anywhere between half an hour and maybe an hour for most of my episodes. Some of those discussions may have gone on for more than 2 hours. And that's not because we cut bits out. It was effectively like, right, we asked the questions, thanks for coming on. Then you'd stop recording and you'd be like, oh, thanks for your time. And then they would start asking me questions, or we'd just start having a conversation, and another hour had gone past and you felt like that person a lot better. And I guess that not just the generosity of their time as well, but actually people just saying yes. Like, cannot believe when you send a message to the man in charge of the Red Arrows, or the guy who's commentating on BT Sport, or whoever it is. And it's not necessarily saying you're chasing celebrities or anything like that, but people have very busy lives. Most of these people have children as well. They are full on. And they're willing to spend an hour, 2 hours of their time. And I think that was kind of seesaw effect in my head, because I was hugely, even more acutely aware of the value of time. So, if I've got a choice between spending time with my kids and whatever else it is, and then some complete stranger messages me and says, do you want to have a phone call? And a lot of them are saying yes. And it's like, oh my God, you cannot thank them enough for that. And then when people's feedback comes in that it's had an impact on them, you're like, I try and make sure I pass it on as much as possible, because I feel like that does make a difference. It really does. Good. There you go. That's the biggest shock.
I've got one more question, and then I've got a bonus question at the end that I thought we could finish on. It might be a nice time to finish. But anyway, question 5 is, what advice would you give to somebody that wants to create their own podcast? So what do you wish that you could tell yourself in January this year?
In terms of what would I say to somebody wanting to create their own podcast, there's nothing stopping you. Just to give everyone some slight insights into it, doesn't cost anything to host it, or certainly on the platform I use, it doesn't. Your kit's relatively simple, and most of it I learned off YouTube videos or speaking to other people who were already doing it. So in terms of people wanting to create their own shows, go and ask somebody out there. I mean, I've had probably 3, maybe 4 different podcasters or people wanting to start podcasts get in touch. We have half an hour on the phone or Zoom or whatever it is. And I'll say, look, I'm not saying this is right, but here's everything I do. I've found that this was a challenge, this was a challenge, this was a challenge, and hopefully help them a little bit. In terms of what would I tell myself at the start is don't put a limit on anything, because some of the some of the number of people I'd had to go to get somebody in the field that I wanted to speak to in some areas, and some that I'm still chasing, is extremely challenging. So I'll give you a little sneak preview into next year. I'm desperate to speak to an astronaut, because it's such a unique field, and I'm sure there's obviously overlaps with many others, but I am desperate to speak to somebody who's left this planet, which sounds a bit bizarre, but you would not believe how many people have done that. There's a global database of it. And when you've typed out in the region of maybe 50 emails to 50 different people who have left this planet, and I'd say probably 90% of them don't come back to you because obviously they're quite busy or they don't get signal in space. And then I've had a few that are, we're really busy or we can't or whatever it is. And then you get a few threads that are like, come back in January or come back in March because this is going on or that's going on. So I think the message to everyone out there is don't put a limit on how far you can go with it within reason. Within reason, there's almost anything you can do. If you're willing to invest the time, you're willing to work hard, and you're resilient enough to be able to take no quite a lot, then you'll get through it. And I think something I've picked up, kind of, especially listening to interviews with successful actors and people like that, is that they will talk about their auditions. So they'll actually talk about how many auditions you have to go to make it. And everyone just sees the end product, but they don't see all the times you're told you're not good enough. No, I haven't got time for you, or your CV doesn't match up, or whatever it is. And I think that's probably the biggest thing I would have told myself at the start, is be prepared for that. And I think my athletic journey prepared me for that anyway. But I think going back to anyone out there, and let's flesh it out wider than podcast, anyone looking to start something in the next 12 months in their lives, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a blog, whether it's write a book, whatever it is they want to do, be prepared for challenge to happen. And I feel like I'm lifting words out of the Jake Humphrey interview, because he said that. He said, expect challenge. And if you expect it, when it comes along, you're like, I've been waiting for you. I'm ready for you. I'm going to take you head on. And then actually you take it in your stride. Not to say it's not going to knock you off track a little bit, because it does. And some things massively off track. This year has changed the working world like no other. But actually there's people who have dealt with it in a really good way, dealt with the challenge and strode on through and out the other side. And I think that's kind of where I'm up to with it.
I'm glad you said about your athletic journey, because I was going to say, you surely a perfect example of grafting is I think back to our days at university when we used to train 7 times a week, and all you had to show for it was a time that was sub 30 on 50-meter backstroke or something. So the end goal is always far more simple and far more easy to explain than the training that was provided to get it, wasn't it? So I'm glad you mentioned that. It actually leads on very nicely to the bonus question, almost like it was planned, Kevin. So as you said, there's no limit to what you can do. You said that there's no reason for you to stop grafting and stop contacting and everything. So who's the perfect guest? If you could have anyone, I don't know if you want to extend it to life or death, so people that are still with us or not, but who is the most perfect person that you would like to interview next?
I'm going to say 2 then. We'll go alive and dead. Alive, I would interview Obama. I'm listening to his book at the moment, and the aspirational language he uses is some of the most powerful I've ever heard, which you would expect from a 8 years in office as president. But actually, it's incredible. Like, it's absolutely, and I'm listening to this 29-hour audiobook, which accompanies me to the gym and when I go running. But actually, I'm loving it. I'm really enjoying listening to that. And he's somebody that I would have to spend a lot of time preparing, I think, to learn about different aspects of his life to the point where I'd feel comfortable probing, because a lot of his life is in the book. But yeah, I think Obama. And without sounding, I guess, too self-centered, I'd love to interview my dad, but I don't know if he would have the level of and I don't mean dishonesty in a bad way, but I don't know if he would be able to answer some of the questions that I would ask him. But I have been on such a journey over the last 18 months that I would love to now go back. And actually, if we extend that to all, like most of us, if we're lucky, got to know our grandparents. My dad's dad died when I was like 7 or 8. So I never got to know him as an adult. And I think that's probably one of the fortunate things that anyone who's sadly lost their parents as an adult has, is their adult memories. Whereas I think your childhood memories are so different. So I think even going back to maybe my grandparents, great grandparents, you know, my great grandfather was in the war, all those sorts of things, and actually go back and interview people to just learn more about your own past and the people that came before you. So I don't want to end on too much of a morbid note, but I guess actually 2 people I would love to interview would be those 2.
I did think you'd say your dad when I said, but yeah, I guess to finish, it's a real shame because I know a previous American president does listen, Donald Trump. So would you not be interested in interviewing him, or is he not on your list?
Is that the Billy bonus question that you were going to try and knock me down with? I'm going to subtly sidestep saying I'm very mindful of who I have on my interview, but I'm also very open-minded, and we'll leave it to the listeners to discuss whether I'd have him on the show.
Nothing too political then.
No.
Right. Well, they're the questions that I wanted to ask. So thank you.
You're going to hand the mic back now.
Yeah, back to you.
Well, I have to say thank you for coming on. And I think also thank you along the journey, because a lot of people listening probably don't know, or maybe not have the experience of work that goes into a podcast and the journey of it. And, you know, we chat quite regularly about the different people we could have on. And I've really enjoyed answering some of those questions because it's made me reflect. And very often it's me trying to force a guest to reflect. So I'm glad to have had the tables turned, and there was nothing too controversial there. So thank you very much for sharing your time, Danny.
It makes sense that on a review of the past year that you should review it yourself. So
that's a fair point. Well, I hope the listeners out there took a lot from it, and I really appreciate you sharing your time today, Danny. Thank you.
No, thank you for having me on, Kevin, and obviously thank you to everyone that's still with us and listened to the end. So
awesome. See you soon.
Cheers. Take care.
Well, thank you again there to Nikhil, Lauren and Danny for coming on the show and sharing their ideas. Some quite heavy topics dotted in, but I think it's important that you know why I do this show, and I think it's powerful for the guests to share their own learnings with you. I hope you enjoyed it, and we look ahead now to some exciting activities in the pipeline. As we mentioned at the start, Season 4 has almost finished being recorded. Our Innovation Lab is being launched shortly, and we've got a monthly mail out for everyone to get free content in addition to the podcast. We've got some incredible guests in our next season, and we are covering a wide range of topics, from mental health to equality in women's sport and adventure activities, from crowdfunding to realising a life-changing dream, through to discussions about some of the new sports in this summer's rescheduled Olympic Games. Make sure you're signed up to our mailing list so you hear when Season 4 goes live, the link to which is in the show notes. Also, feel free to check out our fresh new website, theroguemonkey.org. Thanks again for joining us, and stay tuned for Season 4 coming soon.